The marble steps of the Athenian Agora gleam under the Mediterranean sun, and if you listen carefully, you can still hear them screaming. This is a story they never wanted you to know. A story so dark that when archaeologists uncovered the evidence in 1987, the Greek government immediately classified it, and here's why. Every single thing you learned about ancient Athens in school was a lie designed to protect the reputation of Western civilization itself. Right now, as you're watching this, there are museum curators who would do anything to stop me from showing you what I'm about to reveal, because what I discovered in restricted archaeological reports will shatter your understanding of democracy, philosophy, and everything you thought made ancient Athens great. You think you know about slavery in the ancient world. You know nothing. You think the worst happened in Roman gladiator pits? You're not even close. The sound of chains echoing through wealthy Athenian households wasn't just the sound of labor, it was the sound of a systematic torture industry that made enslaved women disappear from history itself. And the wealthy philosophers you learned about in school, they weren't just okay with this, they were the ones designing the punishments. I'm about to show you court documents that describe punishments so brutal they had to invent new words for them. Archaeological evidence of torture chambers built into the foundations of democracy itself, and testimonies from women who survived methods of control that would make medieval inquisitors vomit with disgust. The birthplace of democracy hiding dark secrets. That's not even scratching the surface. This is about a civilization that turned human suffering into entertainment, that perfected the art of breaking the human spirit, that created punishment methods specifically designed to ensure that enslaved women could never resist, never escape, never even dream of freedom. And they were so proud of their innovations that they recorded every detail. Hit that subscribe button right now, because YouTube's algorithm will bury this within hours. They don't want this information spreading. And comment below if you think you can handle learning what really happened in the birthplace of Western civilization, because I'm about to show you evidence that will change everything you believe about the ancient world. The year is dawn breaks over Athens, and in the distance you hear a sound that will haunt you forever. Before I show you evidence that will make you question everything, smash that like button and subscribe, because this channel is the only place you'll get uncensored historical truth. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what we're exploring together is happening despite the best efforts of academic gatekeepers to keep us ignorant. And trust me, after you see what's coming, you'll understand why they're so desperate to hide this. Here's the context they stripped from your textbooks. Classical Athens, 5th to 4th century BCE. The Golden Age of philosophy and democracy. Population roughly 300,000 people. Sounds impressive until you learn this classified detail. 100,000 of those people were slaves. That's not a footnote. That's the foundation everything else was built on. But it gets worse. Women in Athens already had fewer rights than cattle. They couldn't own property, couldn't speak in court, couldn't even leave their homes without male permission. Now imagine being a woman and a slave in that society. Double the oppression, double the vulnerability, and as you're about to discover, punishments specifically designed to exploit both. The procurement system was industrial in its efficiency. War captives from conquered territories, dragged from burning cities, still carrying the ashes of their former lives. Pirates and slave traders with established supply routes, treating human beings like seasonal cargo. Children born into bondage who never knew freedom existed. And before Solon's reforms, debt slavery, where Athenian citizens could literally sell their own daughters to pay creditors. But here's where it gets systematically evil. They had categories, specialized markets for different types of human suffering. Domestic servants for wealthy households, purchased specifically for their vulnerability and attractiveness to male masters. Skilled workers, weavers, cooks, wet nurses, whose expertise made them valuable enough to keep alive longer. Agricultural laborers on rural estates, where no one could hear screams, and no witnesses existed to report what happened. Temple servants and sacred prostitutes, because even their religion required enslaved women for sexual exploitation, and industrial workers in mines and workshops, where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Under Athenian law, these women weren't people, they were property, with the same legal status as furniture or livestock. No rights, no protections, and no recourse when masters decided to experiment with new forms of cruelty. Masters held absolute power. They called it despots. The root of our word despot. They could buy, sell, rent, torture, rape, or kill their human property without any legal consequences whatsoever. In fact, the law encouraged it by requiring slave testimony to be obtained through torture. The system was designed to normalize brutality. But what made Athenian slavery unique wasn't just the scale, it was the creativity. Because when you give absolute power to men who consider themselves intellectuals, who pride themselves on philosophical innovation, they don't just repeat old methods of control, they invent new ones. And what they invented for enslaved women specifically will make you understand why this history has been buried for over 2,000 years. A single mistake could turn an ordinary moment into a nightmare. A cup of wine spilled, a tray carried too slowly, a hesitation in speech. Each slip was met, not with correction, but with violence. The whip of the mastics cracked across skin, leather tearing into flesh. Branding irons hissed against bodies, searing names, symbols, and ownership into skin as permanent scars. Punishment was constant, reminders unending. Sleep offered no escape. Masters would deliberately rouse their slaves in the dead of night, robbing them of rest, until exhaustion itself became another shackle. Food was withheld with the same intent. Starvation did not kill quickly. It broke spirits slowly, keeping bodies weak enough to serve, but too frail to resist. Worse still was the complete absence of protection from sexual exploitation. A slave's body was considered property, an extension of the household inventory. Refusal was unthinkable. Submission was demanded, whether through routine violation or punishment by rape for disobedience. Some women were forced into breeding programs, their children born into bondage, multiplying a master's wealth. In the most depraved households, sexual torture was staged for guests, humiliation transformed into entertainment. Yet even greater than physical torment was the cruelty aimed at the mind. Families ripped apart, children sold away to strangers, lovers separated forever. The mere threat of such loss silenced many before rebellion could form. In marketplaces, public shaming paraded enslaved men and women before crowds. Their humiliation turned into civic amusement, and when one slave was punished, the rest were made to watch, each scream planting terror deep into memory. Daily labor added another layer to this unending cycle of suffering. Some worked 18 hours without pause, tending fires, stirring boiling oils, or handling dangerous toxins with no protection. Injuries were ignored, infections left to rot. A wounded slave was not treated as a human being in need of care, but as a tool broken and discarded. Hunger gnawed at their insides, not as accident, but as policy. Weakness, Rome believed, kept its empire strong. Ports of Athens and Rome, justice itself was chained to cruelty. Law demanded that a slave's testimony be proven through pain. It was not enough to speak. Truth, they believed, could only be wrung from screams. On wooden racks, bodies were stretched until joints took clubs smashed into flesh and bone, until words spilled out between cries. Branding irons burned deeper, each question punctuated with fire. Women endured tortures, twisted into sexual violations. Their suffering doubled in both body and dignity. Crimes, real or imagined, carried sentences more terrifying than the accusations. Theft could mean the loss of hands, a face scarred with iron, or crucifixion along the roadside. Attempting escape brought punishments so cruel, they ensured no second attempt. Tendons cut to cripple forever, a burning fef carved into the forehead. Fugitives run away, even striking a free person, no matter the reason, could end in mutilation or death. Insolence itself, an expression, a look, invited punishments that silenced the body permanently. The tongue ripped out, eyes gouged, scars carved into faces as eternal reminders of obedience lost. The public stage magnified these horrors. Crucifixions were erected in the agora, the marketplace, where the condemned hung under the open sun, their suffering woven into the daily rhythm of civic life. Stoning became communal execution, where neighbors hurled rocks until flesh gave way. For the most severe cases, dismemberment came before death, limbs hacked away while still conscious, agony prolonged until life finally fled. And when death came, it was not the end. Corpses were left to rot where they fell, flesh decaying in public view, so that even in silence, their bodies screamed obedience into all who saw. Adding to this nightmare was a bitter irony. Athens' police were slaves themselves. The Scythian archers enslaved men from distant lands, forced to wield whips and chains against others like them. Brutality was their shield, for hesitation could mean their own death. Female slaves, especially, felt the sharpest edge of this force, targeted with a violence both sanctioned and invisible. Slaves policing slaves, an empire turning its victims into instruments of their own oppression. In the shadows beneath Rome's wealthiest households, punishment was ground into stone itself. Underground chambers housed the mill of suffering, where enslaved women were chained to massive grinders, circling endlessly in airless darkness. There was no pause, no rest, only the grinding rhythm, until exhaustion shattered their bodies. Death was not an escape to dignity. Corpses were tossed into lime pits, dissolved until even bones disappeared, erasing not only life, but memory. High above, another fate awaited, the empire's most public sentence, crucifixion. To Rome, it was more than death. It was spectacle. Rows of bodies, nailed to wood, lined roadsides, hills, and marketplaces, but the variations were even more grotesque. Some victims were impaled on stakes, writhing for hours, as their own weight dragged them downward. Others dangled from trees with iron weights, pulling their limbs apart. Every breath, a battle against gravity. A cross was not merely a killing tool. It was a stage where suffering was displayed like theater for days on end. For slaves accused of striking back at their masters, the wheel turned. Literally, the breaking wheel was a device of annihilation. The condemned bound across its spokes, each limb shattered with iron bars, bone after bone splintering in deliberate sequence. The screams echoed as organs collapsed within twisted frames. Death never came quickly. It was drawn out, lingering, designed to turn the human body into a portrait of ruin. Even worse awaited those accused of poisoning, the gravest betrayal in a world obsessed with hierarchy. Flaying tore skin from flesh, while victims remained conscious. Red wounds met hot coals, searing deeper, until body and soul fractured together. And when death came, it was not the end. Some households preserved mutilated corpses, leaving them displayed in courtyards as eternal reminders that defiance had no hiding place. And sometimes cruelty wasn't individual, it was collective. Rome understood fear multiplied in numbers. If one slave rebelled, many paid. Decimation was their answer. Every 10th slave chosen at random for execution, while the rest were forced to watch. Loyalty or guilt didn't matter. Terror did. The message carved itself into every survivor's mind. You could die not only for your own actions, but for standing too close to someone else's. These punishments were not simply methods of control. They were Rome's declaration of ownership over body, breath, and even memory. By turning pain into spectacle, by making death both prolonged and public, The empire taught the enslaved one lesson above all: their lives were expendable, and their suffering. For enslaved women, punishment carried an extra layer of cruelty. Their bodies were not only tools of labor, but instruments of reproduction. Their wombs controlled as if they were fields to be harvested. Masters dictated who they would bear children for, and when, if a pregnancy was inconvenient, women were forced into abortions, performed with crude instruments, often without care for survival. Some were sterilized deliberately, internal organs burned to ensure they would never conceive again. Others were compelled to kill their own newborns if they were deemed unwanted, their tears weaponized against them. The most degrading of all were the breeding programs, where women were treated like livestock, their children born only to be added to the master's inventory. But reproductive violence was only part of the nightmare. Sexual humiliation was wielded as both punishment and entertainment. Public rapes were staged as spectacles, designed not only to violate, but to reduce women to objects before the eyes of the community. In certain rituals, women were stripped and forced into religious ceremonies, their nakedness transforming devotion into degradation. Some suffered sexual torture with cruel instruments, while others were condemned to prostitution as a sentence for minor household crimes. What was framed as punishment was in truth another way to monetize their pain. Perhaps the deepest wounds were carved, not on their bodies but through their children. To ensure obedience, children were tortured in front of their mothers, their screams twisted into instruments of control. Some women were forced into unspeakable choices, deciding which of their children would live and which would die, a cruelty that tore not only flesh, but soul. In other cases, women were sold away immediately after giving birth, denied even the chance to hold the life they had created. Newborns themselves could be killed outright if their features betrayed the father's identity. Evidence of a master's rape silenced in blood, and when obedience or usefulness failed, mutilation carried a gendered edge. Wet nurses accused of failing could have their breasts cut away. The very organs of nurture turned into sites of punishment. Women accused of sexual defiance endured genital mutilation, pain inflicted, not to kill but to control. Beauty itself was treated as property, faces slashed, features destroyed, scars carved deep enough to erase value in the slave market. Even hair, an emblem of femininity, was burned away. Scalps, scarred as permanent marks of shame. For enslaved women, punishment was not simply about control, it was about domination in the most intimate spaces of body and identity. Their suffering reveals an empire that weaponized gender itself, where motherhood, sexuality, and even beauty became vulnerabilities exploited for power. The brutality of ancient slavery was not only written by historians, it was buried beneath the soil waiting for archaeologists to uncover its truth. Every discovery strips away the illusion of myth and forces us to confront the reality of lives lived in torment. From the ruins of Athenian households come chains and shackles, some small enough to restrain children. In the basements of wealthy villas, excavations have unearthed iron collars, whipping posts, and devices built not for work, but for suffering. Branding irons etched with household marks tell their own silent story. Flesh once burned, identities erased, ownership seared permanently into skin. Even human remains whisper what words cannot. Skulls split, ribs broken, bones warped by years of punishment, all testimony without language. Science deepens the horror. Skeletal analysis reveals fractures that healed and broke again, proof of repeated beatings. Bone density betrays a life of chronic hunger, malnutrition etched into the very framework of the body. Some skeletons show signs of grueling labor beginning in childhood. Spines bent unnaturally, joints worn smooth before adulthood. Crude surgeries leave their scars too. Limbs amputated without care, branding marks visible even centuries later. These bodies did not lie. They bore their history into the grave. Even art and pottery preserved the violence in plain sight. Vase paintings, meant for wealthy homes, depict slaves bound and beaten, their suffering turned into ornament. Household objects reveal hidden purposes, rings and clasps, designed not for beauty, but for restraint. Religious art went further still, showing gods themselves sanctioning punishment, as if cruelty carried divine approval. And in the private corners of homes, graffiti scrawled on walls celebrated acts of brutality, proof that suffering had become so normal it could be a joke, a boast, an idle mark left by an idle hand. Archaeology tears away the distance of centuries, the rusted shackles, the scarred bones, the graffiti of cruelty. Each discovery proves that Rome's system of terror was not exaggerated legend, it was lived reality. The ground itself remembers what empires try to forget. The ancient world left behind not only bones and chains, but words that reveal how deeply brutality was woven into everyday life. From playwrights to philosophers, from manuals to courtroom speeches, the voices of antiquity make clear that cruelty was not hidden, it was accepted. Aristophanes, the comic poet, scattered casual violence into his plays, as if it were nothing more than a punchline. Whippings, insults, humiliations, they were laughter for the audience, entertainment drawn from the suffering of those who could not answer back. Xenophon, the soldier philosopher, wrote household manuals explaining how to manage slaves, with the same matter-of-fact tone used for livestock or crops. Court speeches spoke openly of torture, not as scandal but as procedure, the normal machinery of law. And even in philosophy, where men pondered virtue and justice, the suffering of slaves was rarely questioned. Brutality was treated as natural, even necessary, and yet, scattered among these voices of power, a few rare whispers from the enslaved themselves emerge. Escaped slaves, preserved in later Roman text, describe daily terror in harrowing detail, strategies of survival, the constant threat of lash or branding, the memory of loved ones torn away. Some accounts list punishments with chilling precision, the iron biting into flesh, the wheel breaking bones, the silence after a scream. These testimonies, though scarce, give us the only window into what it meant to live beneath the yoke. They even hint at resistance, networks of escape, secret acts of defiance, fleeting glimpses of courage in a world built to crush it. Not all voices sang in harmony with cruelty. A handful of philosophers questioned whether extreme punishments degraded not just slaves, but their masters. Religious writers warned of divine anger against those who mistreated the vulnerable. Economists sometimes argued that excessive brutality destroyed valuable property, reducing a slave's usefulness. But these were fragments of doubt, not movements. No systematic opposition arose. The institution itself remained unquestioned, an unshakable pillar of society. The testimonies of antiquity, whether comic, philosophical, or tragic, leave us with a stark truth. Slavery was not a shame, whispered in shadow. It was a fact so embedded in culture that cruelty could be joked about, legislated, and even celebrated. Only the enslaved themselves, in their rare surviving voices, remind us of the cost of lives lived in fear, endurance, and fleeting resistance against an empire that gave them no place to stand. The lash scarred flesh, but the deepest wounds were invisible. Slavery in Athens and Rome was as much a war on the mind as it was on the body, and its victims carried that war within them every hour of their lives. To survive, enslaved people developed psychological armor. In the midst of torture, some dissociated, retreating inward, separating mind from body, refusing to give their tormentors the satisfaction of total destruction. Others found strength in secret support networks, especially among women, who whispered comfort shared forbidden food, or offered a hand when no one else did. Out of necessity, coded languages emerged, gestures, songs, subtle shifts in tone, all designed to communicate under the eyes of watchful masters. These were sparks of humanity, kept alive in a world that sought to extinguish it. But survival came at a cost. Children born into slavery absorbed trauma before they had words for it. They grew up watching lashings, executions, separations. Violence became the first language they understood. Submission was learned early, not as choice but as survival, passed down like an inheritance of silence. Over time, the erosion of family bonds and cultural identity left generations unmoored, tethered only to the will of master.